Assessments, yay, all right. Your assessment is definitely required before any special education services can begin. By the way, a school psychologist is the only one who can do a psychoeducational assessment. That does not mean you ignore outside assessments, not at all. You cannot use a single procedure for the criteria. So what and let's read the next one here. Use a variety of assessment tools and strategies and not any single measurement or assessment. So years ago, and you may still find a few districts that misinterpret this, but I tell you, throughout California, years ago, they took that last statement down there to mean that no single instrument could qualify a kid for special education, which is correct. But that they took it to the extreme so that the SAI teacher was not only having to give the Woodcock-Johnson academic test, but they also had to give another academic test, like the Wyatt, or maybe a shorter academic test. So that way they had two academic tests. The psychologist had to give two cognitives, two visual processings, two auditory processings. It was ridiculous, and it was a gross misinterpretation of this. What this law does, the intent, is to say that we could not use just the Woodcock cognitive and the Woodcock academics as qualification. All right. Basically, we're staying in the same, we've got this one big test, okay, and it's covering a lot of stuff, but it's produced by one company, which inherently takes one approach to assessment. They want a variety of assessments from a variety of companies, looking at the child from a variety of ways. So back when we did our discussion on psychoeducational reports, I talked about how I'll use supporting evidence from other assessments, and how we always have a primary assessment, and that's the assessment that has been normed for that particular area, for that particular processing area, and then we bring in supporting data for that. That's important. You always got to have your primary that's been normed. So if you're doing visual processing, you always do your VMIs. But then if you want to bring in supporting data from the Woodcock matrix or the CAS planning subtest, you can bring that in because that definitely incorporates visual processing skills. Okay. So you could not go out and just administer a CAS and say this kid qualifies for ID or not. And of course that's true for more than true for ID, because ID, you've got a low cognitive, you got a low adaptive, and you got a low academic. Okay, everything's below 70 or right there in that 70-ish area. Okay, assessments. So a local education agency must assess a special education student in all areas of suspected disability. We've talked about this before, that the word suspected, it means that we don't have to assess the child in all areas of disability. Now, the level of suspectivity, or when should we suspect a disability, is very low, very low. So you get one poor score, and you might want to look at that and say, hey, do I also need to assess for OHI? Do I also need to assess for ID or what have you? All assessments must be sufficiently comprehensive to identify the child's eligibility and the services that they need. That's your report. That's your psychoeducational report right there. It has to be comprehensive. It has to test in all areas of suspected disability. Now let me say one more thing about that. We typically assess for areas of ID, autism, OHI, SLD. Let's just use those four right now. And you're at a triannual, and the child qualifies under SLD, and you do an SLD assessment. That is, you do a cognitive, you got the academics, you do the visual processing, the auditory processing, the memory processing. But in your summary, you rule out, you state that the child is not eligible for special education under OHI, autism, ID. They do meet the eligibility criteria under specific learning disability. All right. Meeting the criteria under specific learning disability is good. Your tests have shown that. Your assessment shows that. You can even justify ruling out intellectual disability. You gave a cognitive. You ruled that out. And you've got some academic scores here. So I'm assuming you've ruled it out that way too. You did not do an autistic evaluation. But you said the child isn't eligible. That's a problem. Okay? Take the autistic and take the OHI out of your report if you did not directly assess for it. You cannot rule out an area, and your professional judgment isn't enough. You have to have assessed in that area in order to say the child is not eligible in that area. I think as school psychologists, we don't rely enough on our professional judgment, but this is an area where we're not allowed to. You know the child's not autistic, but you didn't assess for it, so you can't say that the child is not eligible. Okay. The assessment, this statement right here sort of reminds us that the only person who can do a psychoed assessment is the psychologist. So the screening of a student by a teacher or a specialist to determine appropriate instructional strategy shall not be an evaluation for eligibility. Okay, that's basically the part of the law that guarantees us a job. All right, tests and assessments must be used for the purpose for which they are valid and reliable and administered by trained personnel. Okay, you're that trained personnel, your speech and language pathologists are trained, your occupational therapists are trained, the outside clinical psychologists, as well trained as they are, they're not trained for psychoeducational reports. And I have gotten in some beautiful reports from clinical psychologists, and they even utilize a lot of the same assessments we do. They'll use the CTOP, they'll use the cognitive tests that we do. Heck, some of them will even use the academic testing. And really what they're writing is a psychoed that they can't call a psychoed. Now you can take that as a school psychologist, you can take that, look through it, and write a review of that clinical psychologist report that sort of supports the clinical psychologist's findings. I would also include in that report, that review, direct quote from the clinical report directly. Get a parent survey that you've done and incorporate it into that review. Get teacher input and incorporate it into that review. And of course, go over the educational history. Any indications of struggling in school throughout their education history, get their attendance, get their grades in there. You're basically doing a records review, incorporating that clinical psych's report. And that can be the psychoeducational report that you take to the IEP meeting. Basically, it's all based on the clinical psych report, but they can't do a psychoed, so you're reviewing it and authorizing it. Tests of emotional or intellectual functioning shall be administered by a credentialed school psychologist. That's you. That's in the Ed Code. No one else can do it as it pertains to a psychoeducational report or as it pertains to special education eligibility. So that goes back, that clinical psych, they do an intelligence test. You review the protocol. If you find it sufficient, you rule it sufficient, and you can use it. This does not mean that you have to ignore their findings. No. It just means that you must review the protocol and say that, hey, it was done right. Okay. Tests have to be validated for the specific purpose for what they were used. They're selected and administered so as to not be racially, culturally, or sexually discriminatory. And they have to be administered in the student's native language unless this is clearly not feasible. That's going to get us into some trouble. All right. Especially those of us in this area in Southern California who do not speak Spanish. I would imagine, in places like San Francisco, I understand they might have a higher Asian population. It could get us in trouble up there. You can use an interpreter to help administer these assessments. Just document the training you do with the interpreter. The interpreter must know that they are to say only what you say and repeat or translate for you only what the student says. They cannot help the student, and they cannot reword the statement without your permission. So you're reading from the Standardized Administration Guidebook, or they're reading and they translate it, and then they want to explain it a little bit more because the kid has this inquisitive look. And you and I, if we were sitting there and we spoke this language, we might use our professional judgment to explain the task a little bit. But they can't do that. They're not trained to do that. So they have to refer that to you. They have to say, I don't think he quite got it. Is there another way I can word this? It's hard because we don't speak the language. We don't know exactly how it was worded in the first place, but you just go with what you've done before. Okay. All right. So the totality of evidence, that is the work sample, the classroom, the test scores, the classroom observations, the surveys, the interviews, the education review, the current grades, all of that in your psychoeducation report must produce a clear outcome. Your psychoeducation report is considered less valid if you do not reach a conclusion. That doesn't mean you have to qualify every kid, but it means that everything is supported toward a does not qualify statement and why the child is struggling. Or all of your evidence points to very clear dyslexia and ADHD, eligibility under SLD and OHI. But your report is consistent internally in that, and this will naturally happen if you're assessing the child correctly. And if you're assessing in all areas of suspected disability, you're going to rule out any sort of a how can I say it? Anything that might take you down a false path. So let's see. What's an example? You've got an SLD kid. In the past, they've qualified under SLD for attention processing. And we've talked about the difference between attention processing and attention deficit. And you're seeing more of an attention deficit. And you start giving some OHI assessments, and the Connors Continuous is pointing toward ADHD. The Connors surveys, the BASC, the classroom observations, everything is pointing toward ADHD. It's pointing away from SLD. And that will become clear as you're writing your report, and you'll just move the student's eligibility over to OHI because everything points in that direction. Okay, if you remember when we did the class on the visual presentation of the psychoed, that again is another way to show how all the evidence points in the same direction. And that's what you want in your psychoed. That's what will happen in a good psychoed. So after you get done with those assessments, it is your responsibility to produce a written report. In a lot of districts, what happens, and this is completely legal, what you see more and more of is the psychologist or the SAI teacher or somebody opening a Google Doc. And in that Google Doc, everybody goes in and puts their part of the assessment. So the SAI teacher writes up the academic testing. The speech and language pathologist goes over here and she puts in, or he puts in, their section. You're putting in your section. That's fine. I don't like it because it can't be formatted nicely and consistently. Or if it can be, it's going to take a lot of work on the back end. So our reports, remember, some districts will call your report a psychoeducational report. Some districts will call it a multidisciplinary team report. You're not writing the report as much as you are assembling it. You're just gathering all this information from different sources. So you want to make sure there's a section in your report that talks about who all contributed to it, and that you're not the author. You're just the one bringing it all together. That being said, though, you must make the decision of eligibility, not qualification, but eligibility. Okay, because that's your job, and that report must be the basis of your decision. If you make an eligibility decision that's not backed up by the report, that's wrong, okay, and that's indefensible. If the IEP team decides to qualify a kid that you found to be ineligible, that's fine. That's legal. That's the IEP team's responsibility. So you're responsible for that report and only that report, and reaching a conclusion based on the information in it. All right, some limitations. So you can't qualify a child for special education if you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they've not had accurate, appropriate reading and math instruction. Okay. And about the only way you can really prove that is if the child has lived in the mountains, they're 9 years old, they're going in, the school's going to put them in 4th grade, and they've had no schooling at all. All right. Now that child wouldn't qualify for special ed necessarily. They're going to need a heck of a lot of tutoring, and it's going to take them years to catch up. But that's not a disability to have lived in the mountains and not gone to school. You can't qualify a kid just because they can't speak English and all the lessons are done in English. Again, that's not a disability. And of course, if they don't meet the eligibility criteria, they don't find them eligible. All right. Even if you know that in your district, there's really no other resources for them. They're not eligible for special ed. There's no resources. They're going to continue to struggle and possibly fail. But special ed is not a tutoring program. It's not a program to meet the general education requirement of providing an education to everybody. And it very often is misused that way. The other way special ed is misused is as a behavior intervention program, which is not. All right, you don't want conduct kids getting into special education ED classrooms. They will destroy the classroom. Okay.